Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at theories of creation in our continuing study through the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 starts off, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it seems quite straightforward. And yet that verse and the chapter that follows have given rise to a number of different theories. As we look at that chapter, the first thing that becomes evident is that there is being described supernatural actions rather than evolutionary chance happenings. Now that's not to say it could not have looked like normal processes of events, and yet that's not the way it's described. It's described as light, coming into being, and things taking place, man being created, not gradually evolving over many, hundreds and millions of years, that rather God intelligently designs and creates. Secondly, we see what looks like a superficial appearance of history in creation. The obvious example of this is Adam and Eve, who were created. They're placed into the garden, and the day or two after they've been created, we can ask the question, well, how old are they? Well, they're 1 day old, and yet they don't look like a 1 day old infant. Rather, they have the appearance of adults, and it looks, I imagine if you looked at them, you would have thought they went through all the process of babyhood and childhood and teenage and adulthood. They look like they've been around for a lot longer. In the same way, Genesis chapter 1 is going to describe God creating trees, not seeds. It's going to describe God creating fish and animals, not eggs and infants. So that creation, at least the parts that are described in ways that we can understand that, seem to have this superficial appearance of history. Thirdly, I want to talk a bit about one theory that was very prevalent back when I was in college. I don't hear about it too often, and yet I ought to mention it, known as the gap theory. This is the theory, and it's taken from the next verse, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, which says, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters." Now, the gap theory says that Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the previous verse, where God created the heavens and the earth, that was original creation, and then something happened to make the earth from being created to instead become formless and void. That it wasn't created that way, that it became something else. And sometimes they try to say, well, maybe Satan fell and sort of plunged the world into sin, and it's usually blamed on Satan. And then the gap theory sees verses 3 through the rest of the chapter as 6 days, not of creation, but of recreation, as God now repairs the earth and brings it back to a habitable environment. The support for this, and we're going to look at both the support and the objections to this theory. One area of support is that Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, it is claimed that the Hebrew word hayata, which means the earth was without form and void, it's claimed that this can be translated became, so that we could read that the earth became without form and void, but that it wasn't originally that way. The problem with that is that's not the normal rendering of that Hebrew verb. Hayata normally almost always is translated just it was. That's the way it was. A second argument in favor of this theory is the Hebrew phrase tohu wabohu, translated in our translation formless and void. And we're going to talk about that next time. That those words constitute a destruction which take place after God's original creation, and that those two words together, are used in Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 23 and in Isaiah 34 verse 11, where you see described a destruction, where Israel is laid waste by her enemies, and it said, "See, it must have been a destruction." However, tohu wabohu can just as easily describe either an unconstructed state or a desolate state. In fact, we're going to look next time at a place where tohu is used in Deuteronomy to describe the desert. In support of the theory, Isaiah chapter 45 verse 18 says that God did not create the earth void. Again, that's the word tohu. While Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 says that the earth was now void, and it's reasoned that the earth wasn't created that way. It must have become that way after its original creation. The problem with that is that Isaiah 45:18 is just telling us God's intention for the earth in its completed form, that it would not, at the end of it, creation be tohu, but that it was designed to be inhabited. And so the prophet is looking at the whole creation account and just stating the purpose of creation. In support of the theory, it's argued that the darkness which characterized the formless and void condition is indicative of evil, because darkness is evil and light is good, except that in Genesis chapter 1 we have cases where God sees the light and the darkness, and he calls them day and night, and he says the whole thing is good. Darkness does not always indicate evil. Both light and darkness existed upon the finished earth, and it was still said to be good. So we can look at, and I really feel we can dismiss, the gap theory. The next theory I want to talk about is known as the day-age theory. This is the theory that says that the 6 days of creation constitute 6 ages, that we're not to take that word day literally. In support of the theory, it's true that the word day is sometimes used in the scriptures to describe a period of time longer than a 24-hour period. We read about the day of the Lord, and even we talk that way. We talk about the day in the day of Moses. Now, normally we say in the days of Moses, plural, but we sometimes use that word day in a non-literal manner. The problem is that the word day does not normally refer to an extended period of time when it appears with a modifier, when you talk about the first day or the second day. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8 talks about how a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. And that's true, but these days are clearly defined in Genesis chapter 1 verse 5 when God calls the light day and the darkness night. So within the scope of Genesis chapter 1, the days are defined. It's argued that the sun and the moon are not created until the 4th day, and that indicates that the previous days are not to be taken literally. And that's a good point, except that the very purpose of the sun was to rule over the day, while the purpose of the moon was to rule over the night. So even when I come to the 4th day, the purpose of those luminaries are to rule over the literal day and the literal night. We've looked at the day-age theory, and while I think it has some merit to it, I tend to disregard it as well. There's also a theory known as the non-sequential and or framework theory. This theory, and I'm going to use the terms unformed and unfilled that we find in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, but this theory looks at just what takes place on each day. And notice on day 1 you have the bringing forth of light, and then day 2 God makes a division between the waters which are below the heavens versus the waters which are above the heavens, and water and sky are divided. And then on day 3 he brings forth dry land and vegetation. Now that's just in the passage. We come to day 4, and the light bearers, the sun, the moon, and the stars, are all made. And notice how there's a link up between what takes place on day 1 and day 4. That on day 1 you had light. On day 4 now we have the light bearers. On day 2 you had water and sky divided. On day 5, the things that go in the water and the sky, the fish and the birds are created to fill the water in the sky. On day 3, you have dry land and vegetation. As we come to day 6, the things that go on the dry land, the land animals, and mankind himself are created. So that there's a certain structure to the entire chapter. Now, that observation is true whether we believe it to be literal or we believe it to be a framing device for the passage. And of course, on the 7th day, God rests. Tim Keller has this to say. I'm going to give you sort of an extended quote of his. He says, I personally take the view that Genesis 1 and 2 relate to each other the way Judges chapter 4 and 5 and Exodus 14 and 15 do. If you don't remember, in Judges chapter 4, you have the story of Deborah, and in Judges chapter 5, you have the song of Deborah that describe in a very poetic way what happened in Judges 4. Same thing that happens in Exodus 14. You have the delivery of Israel through the Red Sea, and then in chapter 15 of Exodus, you have the Song of Miriam as she describes in poetic manner that deliverance. Now, Keller wants us to take Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 in a similar way. He goes on to say, in each couplet, one chapter describes a historical event and the other is a song or poem about the theological meaning of the event. When reading Judges 4, it is obvious that it is a sober recounting of what happened in the battle, but when we read Judges 5, Deborah's song about the battle, the language is poetic and metaphorical. When Deborah sings that the stars in the heavens came down to fight for the Israelites, we understand she speaks that metaphorically. I think, he says, now this is Keller thinking this, not myself. Keller says, I think Genesis 1 has the earmarks of poetry and is therefore a song about the wonder and meaning of God's creation. Genesis 2 is an account of how it happened. I find his opinion interesting and worthy of mention. However, Genesis chapter 1, even though there is a structure to it, it's not really poetry in the same sense of the two examples that he gave. Finally, we come to the literal interpretation, and that's just taking the passage as it stands. I'm inclined to do it that way, and yet perhaps there's a caveat. I'd like to tell you a story about the 7 days of Paula. I first saw her when she was giving her testimony before 1,700 students. Didn't talk to her, just saw her up on the stage, and I remember thinking, she looks nice. That was day 1. Day 2, I happened to be sitting in the college snack shop and was asked if I would come out and give the gospel to some young men who had been invited over to the school. We sat out by the fountain, and among the group there was that same girl. I'm not even sure if I remembered her, put it together at the time, but she was sitting off to the side, and it registered. Day 3, I was getting into the elevator of the college, and the elevator doors opened, and there she was. And between the 5th and the 1st floor, we were the only ones in the elevator, and I asked if she would go to a Bible study with me. Asked her out, and she said no. But she didn't have a good excuse, and so she ended up going with me. And day 4, I told her that I loved her. She wasn't sure what to make of that. It was coming a little fast. Day 5, I asked the question. I started to ask, will you marry me? She got the sense the question was coming, and she got up and ran into the other room, and when she came back, I said, well, just for that, you're going to have to ask me. Day 6, she became my wife. And every day since has been day 7. Now, I've just told you the story about how I met and married my wife, and we were celebrating 42 years now. And I gave it to you in the formula of 7 days, but they were not 7 consecutive days. You see, it was actually a year, and in fact it was a year to the day from the time that first day took place to the time that day 6 where we became husband and wife. But I used the day formula as a way of telling the story, and each of those were literal days, and yet they were not necessarily consecutive. When we look at the Genesis story, it might be that we have, yes, 7 literal days, but they aren't necessarily consecutive. Bruce Waltke, in his book Genesis, speaks about how revelation, general revelation, that is that revelation that we see in all of creation, the things that we see in creation that point to the age of the universe and about how things have happened. General revelation in creation, he says, as well as special revelation of Scripture, is also the voice of God. That is, it's revelation. We live in a universe, and all truth, he says, speaks with one voice. So perhaps we ought to take care as we seek to defend the Scriptures, and we should defend the Scriptures, but we should take care to defend the Scriptures and not merely our own interpretation of those Scriptures.